Hey everyone, this is my year-end book video. I did one of these in June, but I had been reading a few books at that time and I finished those plus a few more. Only one of these is fiction, so if you're not into fiction, you can skip the first book. If you're just into fiction, you can just watch it and skip the rest. In any event, thanks for watching whatever you do watch. First up is Clive Barker's The Scarlet Gospel. Now, when I first got this, I had read some negative reviews and I couldn't understand why because the beginning of the book is really strong. Turns out that's the best part of the book. As it goes on, it gets worse and worse, and I would say it goes by quarters. The first quarter is really strong, then it gets a little weaker, and then by the end, I really did not like the book. I was really surprised with how superficial the characters are. The dialogue is incredibly amateurish. Now, my brother read a good bit about the history of the book, and I knew Clive Barker was sick for a long time. I think he even went into a coma for a while. And apparently, this book was almost halved in size to get to this, which is, I think, about 360 to 370 pages. Clive Barker thanked someone in the foreword for helping with the book, and I think that guy wrote some of it because if you compare the beginning of the book to the end, there is no comparison. The beginning is really strong, some great descriptive text, fantastic setup, and then by the end, it's like fan fiction or something, just or a terrible creepypasta. It's so bad at the end, it's shocking. I did feel bad because my brother sprung for the autograph copy of this, and as we were talking about it, I kind of said I wasn't a huge fan. It turns out he wasn't either, so that was a pretty big relief. Kind of had a bit of a whine session there about how bad the book got. The best part is the cover. This is awesome. I keep it displayed. This is supposed to be the last appearance of Pinhead, and I want to say this is the first book where he's actually called Pinhead, which is the nickname he does not like. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested in this, find a way to read a preview or maybe get it from a library. Just read the first 60 or so pages and do yourself a favor and stop. That opens up with Pinhead killing the last magicians and taking the last remaining artifacts from Earth. Best part of the book, skip the rest. Next up is The Two Lives of Charlemagne by Einhard and Notker the Stammerer. Now, Einhard knew the family. He worked in the court. Notker wrote about 50 years later for Charlemagne's grandson or great-grandson. And they are the opposite ends of the spectrum. Einhard's is a really grounded account of Charlemagne, and Notker's is very fanciful. A lot of colorful prose about the great hammer of divine justice bestowed upon us and all that, where Einhard's much more matter-of-fact. Because that, as it says in the foreword, throughout time, people have preferred Notker's account because it is so fanciful and much more of a fun read. But because they're both included, you get the best of both. Not a whole lot on Charlemagne in English, surprisingly. I have a few books on him. One's not very good at all. The other's okay. And really, most of them just use these two works to base their material off of. It's small, easy to read. I think it's about $10. So definitely pick this up if you have any interest in the Franks or Charlemagne. Another biography is on Saint Severin. I believe the author is Eugipius. Now, this is a very interesting and I would say important work because Severin was around as the Western Roman Empire was falling apart. He was based in Noricum, which is about modern-day Austria. He doesn't talk about where he's from, but by accounts of people who met him, he seemed to be educated. So they think he came from the East and had a fairly solid education. He was well-liked, and he was known in that area for helping the less fortunate. And he did it in a variety of ways. He would collect tithes and taxes in kind, which is with food and clothes, and distribute those to the poor. If there was a raid by a nearby tribe, he would go and try to ransom the people or kind of shame the king or tribal commander to give them back. The nearby kings and queens did like him, and so he had a lot of pull. And that also kind of speaks into a weird aspect in that this is from a religious press, so they don't question any claim to prophecy, I should say, or miracle. But when you read it, you get the impression that he was just given a heads up a lot. You know, he'll say, if you go out in 2 days, God will punish you. So someone goes out and they get taken as a slave. by a raiding tribe. And everyone says, "Oh, look, this miracle." But it really seems like because he has so many friends in nearby tribes that someone just tells him, "Hey, make sure you and your friends are in a safe location by this date because there will be a raid." That's really all it seems like. But he had a huge influence in the area. He evacuated entire towns. He ensured protection during some evacuations. He got nearby kings to assist them and protect the people. The same kings who had recently raided the land, he got to protect the Romans as they left. And when they say Romans, they mention in the forward, they really mean kind of higher class Romans, administrators. A lot of the poorer class was just left there. But you get a lot of interesting stories, like how the last garrison turned out to be mercenaries. So once the Roman administrator left, the mercenaries just simply changed allegiance to the nearby tribal king. I say tribal king, that sounds odd, but there are a handful of strong tribes in the area. So I don't want you to think it's kind of backwards. And many of them had pretty high level courts. So he had influence there, and that's who he's talking to. In another instance, it's the last, it's maybe 40 Roman garrison. Half of them go to get their pay, and they end up dying. And they don't know, but as they're heading to Italy, there really is no one to get money from. The administration has collapsed. So you get a lot of interesting stories, a really good forward, and a great ground level look at what it was like in the western part of the empire as things were deteriorating. Next up is The Last Roman by Adrian Murdoch, who also wrote a really good book on Julian the Apostate. This is on Romulus Augustulus. Some people consider him the last Western emperor. Some people consider Julius Nepos. He replaced Julius Nepos when his father Orestes kind of overthrew in a palace coup. In turn, Orestes was overthrown by Ottokar. Ottokar killed Orestes, killed Romulus's uncle, I think his name is Paul, when he took over. But once he saw how young Romulus was, and that's what the name is actually a nickname. It's a play. It's Little Augustus because he was very young, I think 13 or 14. He actually let him retire to Campania and gave him a retirement stipend. I think it was like 6,000 something gold a year. And they're not sure when he passed away, but they have references to a Romulus in around 506, but he could have passed away sooner, maybe a little later. Actually, the Saint Severin I just mentioned, his body was eventually taken to an area where Romulus lived. That's how they date whether he was alive or dead. Some say when that happened, he was already dead. Others say he might have, him and his mother might have made a spot for the saint. But in any event, there's not a lot known about him, and this book pretty much bleeds every aspect dry. You get a lot of information about the area he retired to, Orestes, Ottokar, what happened to Ottokar, because then Theoderic comes from the Goths, and there's a letter from the Theoderic to him. All sorts of information like that, but not a lot on the person himself because there isn't. So if you want every ounce of information on Romulus Augustulus, definitely check this out. If you just want to know the basic facts, check out Wikipedia. I've looked at it and everything matches up. So if you just want the core, check that out. It's free. If you want to go a little bit deeper, give this one a look. Another biography is on Sertorius, and this is the Roman Republic's fight for Spain. Sertorius eventually fought Pompey before he became the Great. This is by Philip Matizak, who I've read several books from before. And like those, it suffers from being on pen and sword because it's got poor editing standards, or the publisher has poor editing standards, and that bleeds over into the book. But Philip Matizak is a great writer, does good narrative history. You get a lot of detail, interesting stories about how Rome pacified Spain, which is essentially killing as many people as humanly possible. Several stories of a town that was supposed to be moved, but instead the legion surrounded it and just killed everyone. Sertorius managed to hold off. He was on the losing side of a civil war. He managed to hold off the official state forces for quite a while before he was killed. There are not many books on Sertorius himself or the early fight for Spain, so this definitely stands out. You can read about that in larger works, but there aren't many, at least in English, that are dedicated to that. So by virtue of that alone, this is worth checking out. Next up is Robin Waterfield's Taken at the Flood. He wrote a book I enjoy called, I think is Dividing the Spoils, about Alexander the Great's successors. This is the Roman conquest of Greece. This book starts off really, really strong. It was probably going to rank up there with one of my all-time favorite books in the beginning because Waterfield's got a great, concise, and clear style. He can describe all the different Greek leagues and alliances very succinctly. Other aspects of their different democracies, he can just, with one or two words, he's able to just nail it perfectly. But then the book becomes a slog. He starts repeating himself endlessly. Basically, the Romans are imperialists, and you hear that pretty much word for word over and over. The examples he gives, though, don't really back that up. For example, there's an instance where he said the Romans were insulted that Philip of Macedon, Philip V of Macedon, backed out of a treaty they had, but which was really common in that area, but Rome wasn't used to that. Okay. Then another instance, he is building up troops. Okay. So from that, we learn that Rome doesn't really trust Philip, and that Philip is building up forces. Well, then when Philip approaches Rome and asks for a peace treaty, Rome basically blows him off, and the Waterfield says, well, Rome could have had peace, but obviously they don't want peace. They want war so they can expand their territory. But not really going back to the previous points of why would they even agree to a peace if their previous treaty was ignored. You get a lot of that. A lot of hand-waving when it comes to the Macedonians and Greeks, and a lot of finger-wagging when it comes to Rome. Now, it's undoubtedly Romans were terrible to deal with. Every account of them, they're very arrogant, very egotistical, and they had this odd manner about them where they just assumed things. And it happens time and again that a lot of times they assumed it, and it was kind of backed up because someone in the local region thought they could use Rome to their advantage. But what happens is when they find out they can't, the assumption becomes reality. And most of the time they did not want Romans there because Rome would heavily tax cities that they fought with or for, and it just did not work out well for a lot of them in the end. But when you match up what's going on with what Rome's actions, it's hard to really go along with a lot of what's said here. He calls it satellite politics, where Rome would leave a handful of really influential people behind in an area, and they would report back to the Senate, or the Senate would send a commission, and Rome would very quickly send a legion when it came time for campaigning. But decades pass in between these interactions. They fight the Second Punic War in there, so at one point Rome's fighting Hannibal, they have troops in Italy, and there's so many instances where the city-states could do something. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But for some reason, they're paralyzed with fear. I don't know. He just very quickly glosses over all these things. Like, oh, regardless of decades having gone past, Rome was still controlling them because they had a handful of people there. That just doesn't sit well. And it just, some of his points, yes, are true. But going through the book, it's so... like I said, finger wagging. After a while, it just becomes tiresome. Next up is Emperors Don't Die in Beds. If you've read Livy, Suetonius, or Cassius Dio, there's really no need for this. I thought it was going to expound on those some, but it doesn't. So it's very repetitive, or not repetitive, regurgitated. On the other hand, it is exactly what it says. It's supposed to talk about the last lives of every emperor. You get a little bit of context for each. But for me, because all this is so derivative, I thought there'd be maybe some new theories or just some interesting anecdotes or something that hasn't been said before. But he basically cribs from the same 3 or 4 sources. And for my taste, I would rather pay the $3 or $4 extra and get a larger book and spend another week going through it and getting a lot more information. I'm actually giving this one away because I already have the other books, and they literally offer nothing more than that. And finally is Seleucus Nicator, the founder of the Seleucid Empire. He was actually a captain under Alexander the Great and worked his way up into becoming one of the most successful successors of that era. He had a son and a grandson who were also very successful, Antiochus, all the way to Antiochus the Great. You don't really hear about them in this. You hear some about Antiochus, but this is largely about Seleucus, how he is able to navigate Antigones, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and all of the higher-ups in Alexander's, not so much administration, but inner circle, and how he was a pretty wily commander, a pretty good administrator, and who came the closest to reestablishing Alexander's empire. Now, Granger did recently release another book called The Seleucid Empire for Pen and Sword. It's more recent, and some of his opinions have changed, but this is way more thorough. And this is a great buy because it was a $180 or $200 book, but there's this new revival line, so it's only $30 or $40. So ignore the plain cover. It is packed with information. There's not a lot about the Seleucid Empire, despite the fact it's so big, and some of its influence is still around today. So I would also recommend this one. Definitely check this out. Well, and that's it. I am reading 2 more, but I won't be done before the end of the year. And I will get to everyone about June next year about what I've been reading since. Thanks for watching.